Welcome to OAG's latest webinar. Thanks for joining us today. Happy New Year to everyone. I'm Becca Rowland. I'm a partner at Midas Aviation, and I'm based in the UK on a cold and quite snowy day today here. As I say, thanks for joining us. It's always a pleasure to host these webinars, which take some of OAG's latest data along with other interesting data that we found from across the industry, and use that to try and provide some insights into what's happening into the industry. This month, what many of us have been waiting for quite a long time has finally happened, the reopening of China. And so it's not surprising that that's what we're going to be focusing on today. It's been quite sudden, quite unexpected in terms of the timing. And so it's that the focus today will be about what we think will happen over the next year, what's going to happen over the next few months, what difference that's going to make, and so on. As those of you who join us regularly will know, we always repeat the webinar in the afternoon, afternoon UK time, that is. So if you want to join us the second time today, please do. I know in the promotional material we talked about also looking at OAG's Punctuality League data and also some cancellations, and we will be addressing those this afternoon. So if you've dialed in today looking for that information, please join us later. But we're going to focus particularly on China's reopening in this webinar, and what that means for the other markets around China, particularly in Southeast Asia, and also what's happening in some of those markets. We're going to look particularly at India and at Japan today. As always, please send your questions in using the chat function as we go through. We try where we can to pick up your questions as we go along so that they're topical and we can weave them into the conversation. So if you've got any questions you want to ask, then please do so. Joining me today, we always have a couple of guests. We have John Grant and Willie Boulter. Thank you both, gentlemen, for joining us. John Grant is OAG's chief analyst. So you're always with us, John, aren't you? You've always got something to say about the industry. I'm guessing that you were expecting a quiet holiday over the Christmas period, and instead you probably had plenty of calls from the world's media about cancellations and what was happening with flight groundings and all sorts of things. Was it a busy time for you?
Moderately busy. It sort of picked up about 1 o'clock in the afternoon when the US opened, generally, Becca, and people wanted to talk about Southwest and cyclone bombs and things like that and impact on aviation. But that's all behind us now, and Happy New Year to everyone, and let's hope it's a good one. And of course, next week it's the Year of the Rabbit, which is supposed to be very prosperous for the Chinese community. So fingers crossed on that count as well.
Yeah, well done for getting a mention of that in. We've also got with us today for the first time Willie Boulter. Thank you very much for joining us. I know you're partly based in Japan, but you're actually in the UK at the moment, so not too far from where we are. Willie was until recently Chief Commercial Officer at Indigo, having previously worked widely across the industry with a range of well-known airlines across a range of functions and across a number of continents. So your most recent experience at Indigo must have been an exciting time to be at an airline like that, growing rapidly. And you know, when I look at the numbers and see how much they've grown since you joined them in 2018, despite the pandemic, quite a lot of growth there. So an exciting time to be part of an airline like that.
Yes, certainly. I mean, 2018 and 2019, Becca, were very exciting years, and really
exciting. Yeah.
And then, then we hit COVID, of course, in 2021 and 22. But really of relevance to today, perhaps, is that in 18 and 19, I mean, Indigo, we were growing our international footprint very fast. We had been operating to some destinations, mainly in the Gulf. But in that period, 2018, 2019, we grew into points like China, Malaysia. We added destinations in Thailand, we added Hong Kong, and so on. So it was a very exciting time, and India is a great market. I think we're going to touch on that a bit later. But delighted to join today, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody in Asia.
Yeah, good to have you with us, and I'm sure you know your experience in India and in Japan is going to be really interesting today, but also obviously working in Asia, you will bring a lot of insight about China as well. Okay, let's crack on. We always start with a quick look at the sort of picture globally with domestic capacity. As I've said before, we look at capacity at this point rather than traffic, because the data is current, and we can look forward a little bit as well, because the schedules are loaded in systems, which gives us a sort of sneak preview of what's going to happen in the next few months, where traffic data is always historical. John, do you want to talk us through what we're seeing here, and give us an idea of what the picture is for the next few months?
Yeah, sure. So if you look on the left-hand side, you can see the chart that shows capacity by month through to the end of April. The yellow dotted line is obviously the forward capacity. Don't be too alarmed when you see what looks like quite a significant reduction in capacity in April. That's because the Chinese airlines have yet to finalize their summer 23 schedules, and they're not released to the GDSs and the reservation systems. So we would expect that to come back up, particularly in light of what's happened in the last couple of weeks and the relaxing of entry requirements for China. So it's edging ever closer to 2019 capacity levels, which is really positive. This week is the first week when we actually have more capacity in the United States, which is the largest single market in the world, and you know that's surprisingly perhaps 2% up on 2019. So there's lots of positivity around. The challenge, Becca, has always been about the recovery of international capacity rather than domestic. Throughout the whole pandemic, we frequently commented on the fact that, you know, those country markets with big domestic demand and services, the US, Turkey, Indonesia, Japan, China, were able to flip capacity, and the airlines were able to continue to operate with some degree of production. That wasn't the case in the international market. It still remains that way, particularly in Southeast Asia, and hopefully China is going to solve those issues in the coming months, although certainly not next week. I think between now and the end of March, we'll see the usual half-term capacity injection, particularly from the low-cost carriers who suddenly find another 500,000 seats in Europe and put them on, and everyone goes skiing or tries to find some winter sun. And beyond that, it's pretty flat. We're hovering at about 95, 96 million seats a week at the moment. And one of the great unknowns, although I think, you know, there's growing consensus, is that it's going to be difficult to grow much further out than where we were in summer 2022 for many airlines, for all sorts of reasons, resources, airport capacity. I don't think there's an airport in Europe that hasn't held a job fair or is going to host a job fair in the next 7 days as they try and find people to work at the airports and help on the operations. So it's a challenging thing. And of course, the last two unknowns are aircraft deliveries. Interesting, yesterday Michael O'Leary said he's expecting between 45 and 57 aircraft by the end of May, but he doesn't know the precise number because Boeing don't know the precise number. And the spare parts, you know, finding spare parts for aircraft is very challenging, and for that reason, bringing back aircraft that were in the desert, putting them through the necessary maintenance checks, getting them back online is proving a challenge. So it's a better position than it was. Yields are still very strong. Unlikely to see the £9 fares this summer, I think, anywhere in the world. It's generally looking okay, I think. Fuel prices softening a little bit, yeah, should be good. Willie, what do you think at the headline level for this year? Do you think better than last year?
Yes, I mean, I think definitely you know, everyone in the industry is looking forward to 2023 as being finally the year of recovery after, you know, this sort of once in a lifetime event of the pandemic. And I think you make some good points in terms of the capacity, particularly the airport issues, which we've seen have been pretty extreme, not least at Heathrow over the last year or so. So yeah, I think everyone's looking forward with optimism. If we zero in on China for a second, I think I saw some numbers from sort of the mid-January period. They're back to about 80% domestically, and as you mentioned, as we go into the summer schedule and the summer schedules get published, one anticipates that they'll be back pretty close to 100%, and possibly as early as the end of the month for Lunar New Year. They need to get close to that just to cope with the traffic. So yeah, I think, as I say, everyone's fairly optimistic. You've mentioned fuel prices softening a little. Obviously, no one is in the business of predicting fuel prices really in the airline game. It can, you know, surprise one in both directions. At the moment, if you look around the world, I mean, there is still a significant amount of geopolitical risk, I think, and so one assumes that the oil price will stay where it is in the sort of high 80s, low 90s.
Okay,
But
great.
as I said, generally, let's try and be optimistic for 2023.
That's you sound like John. Actually, he's always trying to be optimistic, so that's great. Let's have a look at some of the specific countries in Asia Pacific. We've pulled out some of the larger markets here. What we're seeing is China, India, Vietnam, or when we look forward with the capacity, looking to exceed 2019 capacity in the next few months. That may or may not happen. We know that China loads the data quite late, and there's a lot of volatility in the Chinese schedule. But the trend for many of these countries has just been a nice steady upward trend, hasn't it, over the last year or so?
It has. I mean, Vietnam has been an amazing market to look at over the last 3 years in the way that it has flipped from international expansion to a lot of domestic capacity. Then suddenly it has a shutdown, and you know, capacity is cut and wiped out just like that. Then it bounces back, and it's been a consistent pattern. It's going to be really interesting in the context of everything that's happening in China and Southeast Asia, as to how Vietnam develops its tourism market. It had become a popular destination. It was beginning to compete with Thailand, and it will be interesting to see how that shapes out in the next 12 months as the Chinese traveller returns. India is, well, I mean, India is just, you know, we've said for probably the last 12 months, it's the hottest market in the world. It's got rapid growth, exciting developments in the low-cost sector that Willie's been partly involved in. The rebirth of Air India, I'm not sure if it's Air India Mark 7 or Mark 15, but you know, it's another attempt. New CEO, Campbell Wilson, coming out from the Singapore Airlines Group, big aircraft order, and some developments that they're already putting in place. So all in all, I think, you know, there are some really, really strong positive messages and opportunities coming out of Southeast Asia. I think the challenge is going to be who are going to be the winners and losers, who are going to be the immediate benefactors from China, and who are going to be those that perhaps are slower burners and take a bit of time to recover. And we're already seeing some of those geopolitical things that Willie was talking about in the context of China, and visas, travel restrictions, PCR tests that we're going to touch upon in a minute.
So India, we're looking at quite strong GDP growth, aren't we, this next year? I think, Willie, did you say it was about 9% when we spoke yesterday? Which, you know, normally in my long experience in the industry, 9% economic growth translates into, you know, maybe 15, 16% traffic growth. Is that what you think we might be seeing in India over the next year?
Yeah, I think that's one of the big changes coming out of the pandemic is the relative reduction in Chinese growth and GDP growth, and obviously India. I mean, India had reached 7-8% levels pre-pandemic, and it looks like they will be sustained over the next few years, I think. The economic sort of news in India is on the whole very, very positive. And as you mentioned, there is this rule of thumb that we stick to in the airline business, that GDP growth times 2 is the resultant traffic growth, at least domestically. And that's certainly what we saw before the pandemic, where in certain years, traffic growth in India was in the region of 20% against that GDP growth of sort of high single digit, 7, 8, 9%. So yeah, India is a very buoyant market, and certainly compared to other markets around the world. And this chart shows, India obviously was affected by the pandemic, but if you look at it, it was the least affected of all the territories pulled out here. So I think, yes, especially in India, one can be pretty optimistic this year. Whether that will translate into airline profitability is a different question. And you've seen many carriers in India struggle, including the one that I was employed with for 4.5 years, Indigo, which pre-pandemic was a very profitable machine, but then fuel prices went up, and then we went into the pandemic, and it became more difficult. But I have seen some speculation in the press. Obviously, I don't have any specific knowledge anymore, but there has been speculation in the press that Indigo will report a profitable quarter for October, December. So let's see.
We've certainly, in the webinar we did last month, we talked quite a bit of length about how some of the constraints in the industry, which mean that capacity isn't perhaps growing as fast as people thought it would, actually are helping to keep fares higher, and we're seeing a fairly good round of profitability.
I think we need to be cautious about this. IATA, the trade association, are expecting 2023 to be profitable for the industry. When you actually begin to drill down into the numbers and the geographic breakdown, 55% of that is expected to come from the North American market, and particularly the North American domestic market, where capacity is constrained. There are very high airfares, and there isn't a lot more capacity coming into the market. Then you have the cluster of the legacy European carriers and the low-cost carriers, the Ryanairs and the EasyJets, and to a lesser degree the Wizzes in terms of profitability. Then you have the big 3 carriers in the Middle East. Singapore Airlines will make a profit because the government will make sure Singapore Airlines make a profit, because that's what they want the world to hear. But there's 900 airlines operating scheduled flights this week, and there is a very, very long tail of unprofitable airlines that will still have some challenges and difficulties as we go through this year. And that's the balance, and I guess that's what Willie was facing in Indigo, is the balance between growth and trying to be profitable at the same time, and trying to grow to hold on and say we're going to be profitable because we've got so much mass in 3 or 4 years. It's that period that you have to go through.
And we've had a really interesting question in. Thank you, Aman, for the question. About the role cargo plays in all of that. So we had, for a couple of years in the pandemic, actually a lot of airlines were able to pivot to cargo and made some money on that, and that's quite weak at the moment. Will they be able to move back to passenger traffic, or is the weakness in the cargo market something that's going to make a material difference?
If you're a cargo operator, it's a big difference. Willie, I mean, what are your thoughts? I think it's going to be broadly neutral with the passenger recovery.
Well, I mean, I think, and I focused on cargo a lot at Indigo, my last job, but then having come up the sort of Cathay Pacific way, where cargo is an integral part of the airline, as opposed to being a bit of an add-on for many airlines. I'm a great believer in cargo and what it can do for an airline in terms of profitability. And of course, as you mentioned, we saw through the pandemic, this huge spike in cargo rates and yields. And you saw a lot of airlines get into carrying, freight on passenger aircraft. I mean, we did a lot of it at Indigo, flying into China, bringing medical supplies out of China at one stage, but also more generally around the region. And you've seen big European carriers. I think Virgin were operating a lot of cargo flights into Shanghai at one point on passenger aircraft and so on. But what we've seen since the pandemic, with the gradual sort of lessening of the effect of the pandemic, is that cargo rates have tumbled. And there were a number of things that were feeding into the very high yields that you saw over the last couple of years. I mean, not least the disruption in the shipping market to an extent as well. And then you've seen indeed shipping companies, get it, CMA, CGM, for instance, and Maersk, get into cargo and acquire some air freighters, some 777s and so on. And I think that is a classic sign of a market that is a bubble fundamentally. And I'll be very surprised if those three shipping companies who have bought or leased air capacity over the last couple of years, I'll be very surprised if all three are still running those aircraft in 3 years' time, because what you've seen recently is air freight rates have basically gone a long way back to where they were pre-pandemic, and that's because of the additional capacity has come back, the belly cargo, and remember, half the world's air freight travels in the bellies. The belly cargo has come back with redeployment of wide-bodied aircraft internationally, and I think through 2023 you'll see rates in the cargo market will stabilize again to something much closer to what they were pre-pandemic than the sort of 2 or 3 times that you saw during the pandemic. And through the pandemic, many airlines have started passenger to freighter conversions, not least my own Indigo in the past. And I was the big sponsor of actually converting some A321 aircraft, the CEOs, into freighters, and they have, I think, now 2 of them flying. But that was done very much with a recognition that the pandemic yields were very unusual, and it wasn't done in reaction to the pandemic. It was done as a strategy because India is relatively undersupplied with freighter aircraft. So it was done very much with a long-term strategy. But I think you'll find a lot of the conversion programs have been put in very quickly, and they are going to come a cropper, in my view. I think there will be too much freight capacity in probably a couple of years' time, because you've got new aircraft coming in, the 777, updated freighter coming in, and then you've got 350 freighter coming on the market in the wide bodies, and you've got a whole slew of capacity coming narrow-bodied. So I think cargo is coming, it is a bubble. And
we'll have to have you back to talk about cargo specifically, I think, at some point, Willie.
Sorry, I get passionate about it because a lot of people ignore cargo or treat it as a stepchild. A lot of sensible airline management that should know better, but it's because they don't have people who've grown up with cargo in their blood, and you have to realize it's an important contributor to any airline's profitability.
Yeah. I always hark back to the Delta Airlines Atlanta Lima service, that when it was converted from a 7.5 to a 7.6 and had cargo capacity, turned into their most profitable Latin American route overnight. Stories of asparagus and chilled asparagus being flown up into North America, or perishable flowers and things. It can be so valuable. So valuable.
Okay, I'm going to move you both on so we can, we're going to move on from cargo, if that's okay, and start looking at China in a bit more detail. So we've got a table here. It's just one way of trying to look at some of the responses that have happened in other countries to China's very sudden decision to, or what appeared to most of us anyway, a sudden decision to reopen from the 8th of January. A whole slew of countries put some sort of requirement on Chinese travellers. Mostly the requirements are on, or in some places they're for all travellers because they don't want to single out China. As you can see with the left-hand column, mostly requirement for a negative COVID or PCR test, which actually for Chinese travellers isn't a big deal, I'm guessing, because they perhaps are the most tested nation on earth, and my understanding is that tests are probably still free in China. So perhaps not such a big deal, but interesting in a way which countries are missing from the list. Countries like Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand. Thailand was going to require evidence of a vaccination, and then on the day that was going to take effect, they changed their mind under pressure, I believe, from the tourism authorities. So a lot of sensitivity about how they handle Chinese travellers coming in, what restrictions there are that are put in place. Will this make a difference, John?
No, this is gesture politics, isn't it? This is being seen to be doing something when actually, you know, in reality, it's a so what type event. And as you said, Becca, PCR testing until quite recently for any of us who wanted to travel was you know, an essential part of the qualification process before you got your boarding card. And taking the UK as an example, you know, so what if you take a PCR test and you are found to have COVID, then you don't have to isolate. So it's not as though it's actually, it's a process, and it's an acknowledgement, and it probably satisfies as much the local populations and communities in those countries as it does anything else. You know, COVID, as we've long said, is you can't lock it in a box or put it in a bottle. It travels around the world. It affects every community, and we have to learn to live with it. But this does play to the whole heart of geopolitics and how it can impact aviation around the world.
So while that's all quite positive, we're just going to have a look now at what's actually happening with capacity. Top chart is China's domestic capacity over the last few years, and as we saw before, the dotted line is the capacity in the schedule at the moment for the next few months, and the bottom chart, international capacity. We're not seeing a big rush to add capacity internationally, are we, John? Do you want to talk us through the different dynamics we're seeing? You know, we've got something with Europe and overflights. We've got something with the US, with maybe all their capacities already deployed in the schedule.
It's complex, and I think, you know, this is a half glass half empty sort of opportunity here, because you can say the international market has, you know, is still very soft, and you're absolutely right, but that is where the opportunity will be, and that is where the growth will occur. And it will occur at different speeds and at different rates in different parts of the world. And its value and its strategic importance will be very different in Southeast Asia than it will to Europe and to North America. But when you announce the easing of restrictions on the 8th of January, it's just impossible for the airlines or the market to respond immediately. Schedules are baked in, forward bookings are already in the systems. In the case of China, you know, Saturday is New Year's Day, the Lunar New Year, big holiday, lots of people traveling around China. So domestic capacities, you know, is consuming a lot of that aircraft utilization that is available. So that's no great surprise. We had in the last couple of months seen some increased international activity from China. So most of that had been to Macau and Hong Kong, and continues to be to Macau and Hong Kong. And apparently some of that is around people traveling to Macau to get a Western COVID vaccine and a certificate. But also it's about the easing of travel restrictions in Hong Kong and Macau. There's been selective flights from China to Europe, some of which has been facilitating returning university students. And the education market should never be underestimated from China to Europe or Australia. So it's, you know, it's slowly beginning to change. I think it's going to be a ripple effect. You know, the biggest impact is going to be seen in Southeast and Northeast Asia to begin with, and we have a smattering of that traffic will begin to flow out to North America, VFR traffic for visiting friends, family and relatives. You know, the Chinese diaspora in the United States is huge. But it's also interesting to see how this will shake out in terms of airline capacity. Chinese airlines will have a huge advantage operating from China to Europe for the foreseeable future with the closure of Russian airspace to European airlines. Chinese carriers will be operating sector lengths perhaps 2.5 hours less than their European counterparts. Their cost base is 30% lower than their European counterparts already. And I genuinely believe European airlines will be very, very cautious about re-entering the Chinese market, particularly when they have those disadvantages to carry forward. And in the US, Delta Airlines CEO Ed Bastian has already said, you know, China's not a priority at the moment. There are other things that we've committed to and we will do, not least of which is expansion in Europe. So it's an interesting situation. I think we all were so frustrated saying, when is China going to reopen? You know, is it this year? What month? What quarter? And now it's opened. Very politely, it's a bit of a damp squib, and we're all you know, thinking, well, actually, there's a bit more complexity here than we originally thought.
And the market is, I mean, you know, I think we all know that mostly it's an outbound Chinese market that was extremely valuable for countries. You know, the Chinese traveler was spending significantly more than other travelers before the pandemic. But there's a lot of obstacles for Chinese travelers as well, aren't there? That you know, the government hasn't been issuing passports for 3 years.
No, 18 million passports issued each year in China pre-pandemic. So 3 years of no passports. Crudely, 54 million passports need to be issued. There's an interesting point here from Petri, who's at Finavia and has been on some of our webinars before. Good morning, Petri. Saying, you know, one of the challenges we haven't even thought about is slot access in China for European airlines, because their traditional slots and bank structures are not going to work. They've got 2-hour additional flying times in both directions. I calculated for Lufthansa to reintroduce their whole Chinese program with the extended flight times was going to cost them about 600 days flying per annum. No airline has 600 days of wide-bodied aircraft capacity sitting around doing nothing, particularly the Germans, who are super efficient.
Yeah, no, that's a strong point you make, John. But I think one can be a bit more optimistic about the Chinese carriers, and hopefully they will be able to add back international capacity quite quickly. And you know, on the critical sort of aspects of passport issuance and so on, I mean, I keep in touch with China, and I believe that now renewal of passports is now down to about a week's pause rather than 2 or 3 weeks, which has been up to recently. And as you mentioned, the issuance of passports was completely stopped for a long period during the pandemic. So that's certainly a factor, but it's I think getting easier. But the other point I would make is that, you know, definitely, and it speaks to perhaps the chart before, but you know, the world is split into two in the sense that there are those countries which are very aggressively, you know, wanting to get back the Chinese traveler, and you're seeing that particularly in Southeast Asia. Places like obviously Thailand is the major one, but even Malaysia, which has put in a temperature check only, and then Indonesia, which has precious little constraints, I think, on Chinese at the moment. Even Singapore has made noises about getting the Chinese traveler back. And so you're seeing Southeast Asia, really opening up in a big way, whereas countries like Japan and Korea are being much more nervous about letting the Chinese tourists back in, because I think their domestic populations are very conscious about COVID and the spread of COVID and so on. And especially in my second home in Japan, people are very nervous about seeing a resurgence in COVID cases, and they don't want hordes of tourists coming in right now without appropriate checks and balances. So it's quite interesting to me, how different countries are sort of indulging in almost competition, tourism competition, as they did actually pre-pandemic too. But it's being accentuated here, where you've got some people with zero barriers, and then other people putting barriers back in, which they had a year or so ago. So yeah, it will be fascinating to see how it goes. I think your point on the European carriers and long haul carriers is a very good one too. I mean, you won't see that capacity added back, and of course the one carrier that's always in my mind is Finnair. There is a business which has had to completely pivot from what such a strong dependence on China and Northeast Asia. They've had to invest in the US market far stronger, and also operating to new points in India and so on, where the overflight issue is not as extreme. So yeah, it's a mixed bag when you look at international Chinese capacity.
Just taking that,
go ahead, John.
Just taking that for example, a point forward. They're opening 3 new US markets this summer, all of which are One World hubs. So they've got commitments to their partners that they've made there, and they also leased out quite a bit of their wide body capacity to other carriers for this summer. So yeah, you can't suddenly say, oh, excuse me, I'd like my plane back, I'm going to China. It doesn't work like that. So it will be a much slower response in Europe.
I think what's positive is the fact that the restrictions are fairly limited and fairly manageable. I mean, I think what nobody wants is to go back to a situation where some countries have quite restrictive entry requirements, and then other countries have completely different requirements, and we go back to where we were a couple of years ago, where trying to navigate where you could fly and what piece of paper you needed to go from A to B was a bit of a nightmare, and it was changing all the time. We seem to be in a slightly more stable position where broadly there's a sense of openness across Asia, which I guess is good, and let's hope that doesn't change.
Yeah. I mean, I think where the rubber hits the road is actually for the individual traveler in China. When he or she is looking at destinations, then the fact is that you're going to go to the one which has least restrictions, in my view, where you feel more comfortable, that you're not going to be subjected to quarantine as a result of a test on arrival or something like that. So I think it does have quite an impact, in the actual in the market, with choices that individual travelers make. Yeah,
or that sense of risk that the rules might change while you're away in a particular country. You want to, we've talked plenty of times about those countries like Mexico that have just been open throughout, and they've done really well because travelers have confidence that the rules are going to change on them while they're traveling. They're not going to get stuck somewhere. We've got a chart here, we don't need to spend too long on it, but this is all the international destinations that had air service from China before the pandemic. This is January 2019, so 4 years ago today. Now, we know that some of those weren't particularly profitable. Most of them were operated by both a Chinese carrier and a foreign carrier. how long, if you had to say how long you thought it would be till we see a pattern like that again of international air services, are we looking at the end of this year, or is it going to be into 24 or longer?
Good question. I think if you take that sort of very dense area in Southeast and Northeast Asia, that's going to be refilled within 6 months. I don't think there's any doubt about that, either by Chinese outbound or even inbound. And I think the further away you go, then the longer the time is going to take. You know, I think a lot of those European secondary markets may not get a Chinese service to come back. You know, we know that they were unprofitable. There was a rapid expansion of Chinese tier 1 to tier 2 services in Europe, and those markets, you know, are going to struggle to see that capacity come back. And similarly in the US, I think it could take up to a year, maybe even 18 months before most of that is back. Once you consider fleet planning, networks, slot access, etc., and of course Russian overflights.
Yeah. Okay, staying with China, we are just about to enter into Chinese New Year. There were some headlines last week, I think, or the week before. The Ministry of Transport in China has talked about 2 billion passenger trips. Now, that's obviously not trips by air, and it may just be, you know, one-way travel by train, by car, whatever. We know that may be a huge number and maybe just headline grabbing. It's quite hard to you know, see where that's come from. But it was the sort of annual, you know, the world's largest annual migration. What should we expect over the next few weeks? Are we
just a lot of very full flights and finally some decent yields for Chinese airlines on domestic services, I think.
So the sense was, I think, Willie, you were saying to us yesterday that the sense is that, you know, we've been looking at capacity, but actually the planes haven't been as full as they were before the pandemic. There's maybe 10% load factor reduction. So, and the airline, the big Chinese airlines haven't. Did you say, John, that they haven't made as much money in the last year as they did?
Oh, they've lost more money in 2022 than they did in the first year of the pandemic. It's been disastrous for them. You know, I mean, they've a relatively weak currency, lots of dollar-related cost, weakening demand. There's only so many times you can go and visit your mother-in-law in China. You know, however wonderful she is. That domestic demand, as we've seen in many other countries, it begins to wane the longer it's the only product that's on sale. And yeah, it's been a bad year for the Chinese airlines.
Yeah, so I think that's true. And as I touched on, I think that the load factors have been weaker by about 10% than they were pre-pandemic. But not only that, what's interesting to me, and listeners in China will know this better than I do probably, but it seems the yields actually domestically have been relatively weaker through the pandemic than they were before. And you know, this is surprising to me in a sense, in that if you contrast that with India, in India the passenger yields have been you know 30+% ahead of where they were pre-pandemic. Now, you know, that normally would translate into great profitability to the Indian airlines, but of course what happened was fuel prices also zoomed up. So it hasn't been profitable, but the yield picture is quite different, I think, for China as opposed to India. And you know, coming into the Chinese New Year, I think all the indications are that it will be relatively normal Chinese New Year. I mean, last year was quite muted, and the year before, but this year I think people are expecting it to be, you know, back to so-called normal, when it is, you know, as everyone knows who's been there, you know, it is a huge internal migration back to families. So I think it will be relatively normal this year.
Okay. I wanted to look at Hong Kong. So Hong Kong was a really important global aviation market, and you'll be aware of that, Willie, obviously with your time at Cathay. We've seen Cathay add into the schedule more flights to mainland China. They're effectively doubling the number of flights between now and the end of March. What are the prospects for Hong Kong going forward, and for Cathay in particular?
It reminds me of a song, things can only get better. And they will. It's just going to take a bit of time. You know, Cathay is a very shrewd organization. They'll manage this as well as anyone probably can. China is crucial to them. They need to recover that, but part of the strength of Hong Kong, of course, was it was the gateway to China for most, for a large proportion of travelers. You know, routing through Hong Kong was just the accepted way of getting to a secondary point in China. So I think, you know, things will get better for Cathay. One of the things we were touching on when we were looking through the data yesterday was, of course, resources are going to be a challenge. They lost a lot of expatriate operations, flight deck, cabin staff during the period. They've got to bring them back in. But that helps in some way, because that will allow them to manage the recovery and the capacity recovery. And to the point we were just discussing about yields, I suspect that the yields from Hong Kong to China will be much higher than they were pre the pandemic, certainly in the short term, because there will be some capacity constraints in place.
Okay.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The only thing I'd add is that I think Cathay, you know, Hong Kong is obviously a huge transit point, and anecdotally, what I've heard in the last few weeks is that you know, flights ex-China, especially ex-Chengdu and so on, and the secondary points into Hong Kong have been very full with transit traffic. And as people in China, individual tourists want to you know, indulge in revenge travel in Southeast Asia, and I think you're seeing quite a lot of traffic ex-China into Southeast Asia through Hong Kong. And the prognosis must be pretty positive for Cathay for the, you know, over the next year as they build back capacity. I think certainly there are operational issues at any airline as they address, you know, coming out of the pandemic. But I think, you know, having been in airlines a long time, I do think that some consultants and others have sort of overplayed these issues. I mean, it's so fundamental in airlines to make sure that your operations can support the amount of commercial activity that you want to put on. And, you know, woe betide the operations department that has left pilot re-recruitment, or how one calls it, or bringing aircraft back from the desert too late. I think, you know, most of the world's sensibly managed airlines will have anticipated the end of the pandemic and are bringing capacity back well in time to operate commercially. I mean, I have in my career, I was once in a position as the commercial director, you know, wanting to put on flights and not having the crew, in that case, crew resources available. And I can tell you, you know, it was not a happy time. I think any airline wants to avoid that, because it's you know, it's a horror story when you've got commercial demand and you can't operate. So I think most carriers will have anticipated this upcoming uptick in 2023 and will be making plans accordingly.
Great. Okay, we've got 4 slides left, so we're going to have a quick look at India and Japan. But before we do that, we've got a few of these Southeast Asian countries that have got quite ambitious numbers they've put out in terms of how many Chinese visitors they're hoping for in the next year. We may or may not wish to take some of these with a pinch of salt, but I think I just wanted a view from you about the extent to which we expect the main destinations for outbound Chinese travelers that we saw before the pandemic to return in that form now, or are we going to see a change in the sort of pattern of Chinese travelers? We know from what we've heard that they have throughout this last few years continued to use their social media to you know, discuss travel amongst themselves, where they're going to go, talk about their bucket lists and so on, and research where they're going to travel. It's not like people have stopped thinking about travel in China. But are we going to see, you know, new places, perhaps, you know, countries like Saudi Arabia suddenly emerge as quite significant or potentially significant destinations? You know, we know places like Saudi Arabia have made it easier in terms of visas for Chinese travelers to go there, or is it still going to be the Thailands, the Indonesias, the Vietnams, and so on?
I think I'm going to sit on the fence, which I don't do very often, and say it's going to be a mixture. You know, there are going to be the large mass market is going to go back to those places it feels most comfortable, where, you know, they know that they are very warmly welcomed and that the product is what they want to see and receive. But I think you raised an interesting point about places like Saudi Arabia, the Neom project, the Red Sea resorts and the Riviera and the history and the archaeological sites. And I think what we've got to remember is, to those destinations, you know, a percentage point share of the outbound Chinese market, which may be 20 or 50,000 people, whatever it happens to be, would be almost a 15 or 20% increase in the number of visitors to that destination at the moment. So it's all relative.
Yeah.
And I think that's the important thing. I think some of these numbers are very optimistic. I think some of them are political sound bites that, you know, the local communities want to hear as much as are realistic. But no doubt there's these markets are going to be the immediate benefactors. Willie, I think you were saying yesterday, you know, people are already moving from China into Indonesia via Hong Kong, as you said, and other places.
Yeah, I think you know, you will see the big inbound destinations obviously are keen to recapture the same share they had before, and Thailand is the major one. I mean, they talk about 5 million in 2023. I might be wrong, John, you may know better, but I think their peak was about 8 million Chinese tourists. Was that right? Pre-pandemic, something like that. So you know, they'll have a little way to go there. And then Indonesia is probably under projecting there for this year. I would envisage they get probably more than that, depending on what capacity, of course, air capacity comes on, which is critical. But I think just turning to the sort of new destinations, again, I don't like to speak from anything but experience. And my experience with Indigo was that when we started flying to China, we got tremendous response, because in all these big markets, whether you talk about Chinese outbound market, which of course is the biggest, or you talk about something like Japan, the Japanese outbound market, you know, there is a thirst for new destinations, and you know, there's always a margin of travelers who are willing to try new points. And I think your mention of Saudi Arabia is very germane to this, that, you know, points in the Middle East, particularly Saudi Arabia, but also Qatar as well, coming off the World Cup. They've got a lot of hotel capacity, you know, new hotel capacity. They'll be very keen to improve their share of the Chinese market. So these traditional destinations will certainly have competition from places like India, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on for the Chinese tourist.
Great. Okay, let's have a quick look at India. This chart just shows various capacity from India to a range of countries. I think I've taken the top 15 here, just to see how some are doing relative to others. International capacity from India, I say only down 8.5% versus January 2019. So that's you know, fairly good performance compared to many of the other countries that we've looked at. And at that first slide we had, you know, globally it's down 20%. So this is quite good. But interesting, you know, following on from the previous slide, you know, UAE is up, Qatar's up, Saudi Arabia's up. So, you know, that's maybe for different reasons, but it's that there's certainly some markets that are up for India and some that are performing less well.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, we've done some work in some leisure destinations in the Indian Ocean recently, and don't ever underestimate the value of an Indian wedding. You know, these resorts are so hungry to get a share of the Indian wedding market because it's very lucrative, and you know, large numbers of people attending and traveling, to the point where some are even chartering aircraft, which is mind-boggling.
So one of the markets we show that's up is the UK at 4.4% in terms of capacity, that is. So we've had a look at India, UK, because I think this is quite an interesting one to have a look at. In particularly, you know, a few years ago, I don't know, I wouldn't want to be down on Air India, but it does feel like there's been a substantive change, or there is a change taking place at Air India, which is going to be very interesting, isn't it? We've known about the likes of Indigo doing very well for a few years, but you know, we're seeing Air India add capacity into this market, and perhaps, you know, become more strategic. Perhaps I think, Willie, you were saying to us, you know, they're you know, doing what this market deserves finally, that there's a market there which they were allowing people to travel via the Gulf, and you know, we could see here a third of passengers between India and the UK back in 2019 were traveling via one of the 3 big Gulf airports. So interesting changes.
Well, you know, I think it's been, as you look back in aviation history, I mean, one of the great sort of missteps made by Air India and Indian aviation was the failure to sort of capitalize on their geographical position between Asia and Europe, and Australasia and Europe as well. You know, complete failure to come up with connecting itineraries which would compete. You know, 30 years ago, before Emirates really started, you know, Air India was in that position where they could have really,
they could have been that hub, couldn't they? Yeah.
But they never did it. And you know, we were sitting at the time, I remember I was in Hong Kong at Cathay, and we were sitting there thinking, why are they not doing this? And you know, the airports weren't set up for transit traffic, the schedules were not connecting, you know, and at last, you know, with private ownership now back in Tata hands, at last you're seeing Air India sort of do some network adjustments, which for all of us who've been involved in the Indian market, and I first worked in India in the mid 80s, you know, at last, you know, they're waking up, and you know, their rapid addition of capacity into the UK market is years overdue. Because you can see the size of the market, 3.2 million passengers. I mean, it's a very significant air market, and everybody knows why. You know, the huge immigration diaspora in the UK and so on. A lot of economic ties between the countries, supporting corporate traffic. Student traffic again is a huge thing. You know, it's a massive market, and at last Air India is taking it seriously. I mean, for years, to be fair, there was, you know, constraint bilaterally right until the early 2000s. You know, there were huge bilateral constraints, but those bilateral constraints, they could have been done away with if there was the will to do it from the Indian side. I mean, they were constraints placed largely by the Indian side rather than the British side, who were always pushing for more capacity. But now at last, you know, that is coming through, and I think that it's well overdue rebalancing against the Emirates of the world and so on, the Middle East carriers.
Becca, we have a blog on the Air India developments in the UK coming out at the end of the week. If I could ever get round to finishing it. But there's you know,
so that will be available on the OAG website. For
the OAG website. You know, they're moving 4 destinations to Gatwick from the summer, and those 4 destinations, each and every one of them has more than 95% local traffic. So you know, there's no need for them to be at Heathrow in the first place. It's all local O&D. They operate at crazy inconsistent departure times from Heathrow because of slots. They all depart from Gatwick at 8 o'clock in the evening, so they get a consistent departure time, an overnight flight. They have 2 aircraft on the ground at the same time, so they can actually, integrate and swap fleet and do whatever they need to at Gatwick. And they depart 90 minutes before the Emirates flight via Dubai that used to take all of their connecting traffic. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that shapes up. Does the non-stop command a premium in yield compared to the one-stop via Dubai, or does the quality of the Emirates products negate that non-stop service? Will be an interesting thing. So it allows them to use their Heathrow slots to go double daily on both Delhi and Mumbai, which will be a really competitive product alongside their Star Alliance members. So it's great to see it happening. The one thing I'd be cautious of, I think Gatwick maybe want to be wary of, because history always repeats itself, is if Air India ever found the ability to get a bank of slots and move those services back to Heathrow, would they do that straight away? Probably. And the second thing is, and this is from an on-time performance perspective, this is probably the worst performing market from the United Kingdom to any other country in terms of on-time performance. And one of the biggest protagonists in that was Air India, whose on-time performance at Heathrow has for many years left more than a little bit to be desired. Hopefully that's going to improve.
What I'm hearing from you both is that actually, if we look at this as an example of maybe what Air India is doing, there's it's a thumbs up in terms of direction of travel and a definite improvement.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Good. We've got one more slide. I know we've just gone past 9 o'clock and some people are dropping off. If you're about to leave us, the next webinar will be on Wednesday, the 15th of February, so please do come back and join us then. But if you can stay for just a couple more minutes, then please do. We've got one more slide, just looking at Japan. Willie has lots of experience in Japan, and so having talked about India, we felt we really should just give Willie a chance to say a little bit about India, where it's at. Particularly, I think there's a sense of a contrast with India, where India is growing rapidly. We're seeing a lot of change. Japan's a slow burn market, isn't it, with a bit more conservative.
Yes, and I think that this is the pattern of Japan in most things generally, that the peaks and troughs are sort of smoothed out, and it will take time to add back the international capacity. You've seen some capacity actually added back, I think, a couple of months ago by JAL and ANA to specifically China, which they've now taken back again. So you will see a slow return to normal, I think. But they are moving. I mean, I think they're back to 60–70% of the capacity that they had pre-pandemic domestically, and international is still down, as you can see. But things are getting better, but they're naturally cautious.
Okay, well, I think we've just gone past 9 o'clock, so I think we'll wrap today's webinar up at that point. Thank you both very much. I think that's been really interesting, really timely to be able to focus on China. Perhaps it hasn't given us as much excitement as we might have hoped for. But watch this space, I guess, isn't it? It'll be interesting to see, as always, what happens over the next few months in this market, and the ripple effect across the rest of Asia and elsewhere. Any final thoughts from either of you? John, do you have a bon mot for us, or
have a what? Sorry.
A bon mot, a good word for to wrap up.
Right. Yeah. Happy New Year. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be better than 2022.
It's going to be better.
And I think exciting times in all markets around the world. It's going to be good.
And Willie,
yeah, I completely echo that. Let's have a great 2023.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us, both of you. Thank you for joining our webinar today. As I said a moment ago, we will be back on Wednesday, the 15th of February. In the meantime, please do head over to the OAG website. Have a look at John's weekly blog and all their other regular updates about schedules and traffic and coronavirus and so on. Thank you for joining us today. Bye then.
Thanks. Bye-bye.